Oh, that was a major event, of course, in my life. I was 8 years old, and then suddenly I started feeling ill. Started having all the signs that we then learned became the signs for type 1 diabetes. So something had happened to destroy my beta cells in my pancreas, and I didn't have any insulin, started losing weight, constantly hungry, constantly thirsty. I went to the doctor, and sure enough, it was type 1 diabetes, and that changed everything. Diabetes before 1920s was a death sentence. Once insulin was isolated and made available, it was no longer so. But it was still a very serious disease, and they quickly learned that there were very serious complications that would develop over the years of being treated with insulin. So we're much better off than before the 1920s, but we're a long ways from where we need to be. The early days of treatment, my early days, since say in the 1950s, we were in a primitive world. My father and I used to sit down every Friday night and sharpen our needles on an emery board, and we weren't very good at it. He was better than I was, but neither of us were very good. There was no blood glucose monitoring. There was urine testing, which was almost useless. The insulins were animal origin, and they weren't as purified as they are now, and caused problems of breakdown in the skin and hypertrophy of the lipid layer. There are a lot of problems, and no one knew very much about perfect management of diabetes, nor did they know it was important. I started insulin injections when I was 8 years old in 1957, and I continued with one form or another of subcutaneous injections of insulin until 1992. So 35 years, I guess, yeah. Now, during that time, I did try the new thing of the external pump that could pump continuously rather than intermittently. But it was that 35 years of sub-Q insulin. So I thought I was doing quite well. I was a very athletic, although untalented, athletic kid. I ran marathons and ultramarathons. I built my own companies. I had a good life, and I thought I was doing very well, actually. I thought I felt pretty good. During that 35 years, around the mid-1970s, I was doing some independent research in diabetes that involved taking biopsies of the leg muscles and measuring the density of the capillary basement membrane. And I was very fortunate to have a mentor, Dr. Peter Forsham, and another mentor, Dr. John Karam, who are famous diabetologists. And in our discussions one day, they said, Greg, you know, if we can get insulin into the peritoneum, it'll change everything for you. And I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And so in the mid-70s, I started researching it and thinking about it and learning about it. And in 1992, my doctor, who was treating me at that time, said, you've been talking about this peritoneal insulin delivery for as long as I know. Will you stop talking about it if I get you into a study with an implantable insulin pump that delivers to the peritoneum? And I said, yes, I'm happy to. So in 1992, I had my first implantable insulin pump put in. After having the pump put in, the next morning, I woke up and something was different. And it was very, very nice what was different. And I remember my good buddy came to visit me in the hospital, my friend Mark, and he looked at me and said, so, how's it going? And I said, is this normal? Is this what normal is? Because this is so much better than anything I've ever felt. And it was. And I've had this experience repeatedly over the years when problems have happened with this in development device that they had to stop the therapy for a while and go back on sub-Q and then come back onto the implantable pump. Each time going off was a very disturbing experience. And each time going back on was, the clouds parted and the sun came through. It was a wonderful thing. So that was the moment when I realized that what Dr. Forsham and Dr. Karam were telling me was real. And at that point I decided we've got to find a way to do this for every type of 1 diabetic there is. In 1980, as a matter of fact, when the very research-oriented implantable insulin pump went into a patient in New Mexico, The authors wrote a paper about this, of course, and published it. In there they said the patient relays a remarkable sense of well-being. They didn't know what they had there, of course, and no one else did either. But there's something that happens besides all the good things of control is easier. It's less effort in controlling your diabetes. You can reach very good, what we call A1C levels, a measure of how well you're controlling your blood sugar over time. You can get there without all the dangers that you have with sub-Q insulin. But beyond that, there's something else going on. And it's very basic and it's very known, but we just can't explain exactly what it is. One of the things that I'm hoping that the Implantable Insulin Pump Foundation will help to do is not only help to get a modern pump built that is current standards and current technology, but also to help to fund the research that will get us to the point where we understand what's happening here. We all know, we that have experienced it and the doctors that treat us, know there's something very profound going on. That doesn't carry much water with other people that haven't experienced it, of course, and it shouldn't. But we know there's something there, and we know we can find out what's behind it if we have the time, enough pumps in patients and research time and funds to study it. It's a long answer to a very, very good question of why we don't have a new, modernized, updated version of this pump. The answer goes back to the history of the pump, the 30-plus year history. The very early pumps, of course, were crude. They were, first models. They developed along, many lines. There were a number of companies developing pumps. And then by the 1990s, a very good version, sort of advanced version by a small company called Minimed came out. And that's the pump that I got in 1992. It was very good, but it was still really just an advanced prototype. It wasn't ready to go into full population distribution, etc. During the next few years, more developments were made, but then in 2001, Minimed, as is a normal course of events, was bought by a large multinational company. And when that company purchased Minimed, they favored, reasonably so, the external insulin pump, which was at that time the #1 leading device in the world. Very big business, very, very good business, very good product. The implantable pump was, as I said, an advanced prototype, not ready for sales or distribution, really needed a considerable amount more work to make it really prime time capable. And so that large company decided not to invest money in it or spend a lot of time on it, and figuratively put it in the shelf. And in 2007 decided to cancel the pump altogether. Now, fortunately for those of us who knew that there was something very important here, the French decided that, the French doctors, that they would do all they could to convince Medtronic to continue to support their patients who are very reliant upon this pump. And so Medtronic did. They continued supplying this advanced prototype, as I call it, for the French population. Fortunately for me, and for a few of the people that I know, I happen to know the head doctor in Montpellier who was taking care of these patients, most of these patients. And I asked to be taken care of, and he said, sure, come on over and do so. So starting in 2007, June of that, I went over to France for the first time. And since then have been going every 3 months to have the pump filled or maintained, or new pumps put in or new catheters put in. And there are now 4 other of my friends that go with me, all people who had the pumps in America and were told they could not keep them. So the 100 or so people in the US that were in the studies with the pump, 95 of them lost their pumps, which is a tragedy. A few of us were just fortunate that we could afford to do this and go over and keep our pumps. Managed to keep the therapy going with the same pump, essentially. Minor changes to it, but the same pump. And so now we're in this position where we, as do hundreds of the French patients, know this is the very best a type 1 diabetic can have. And it's not available to people. There's very, very few available. And so if you've lived with type 1 diabetes, you realize how much of a burden it is. It takes a lot of your time and effort to handle type 1 diabetes well. And that's why of all the type 1 diabetics in the world, only 15% or so manage to meet the guidelines of the American Diabetes Association and the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation tell us to maintain hemoglobin A1C levels of 7% or lower. A1C levels are a measurement of the last 3 months or so of how well your blood sugars have been controlled. 7% is their target. What most type 1 diabetics don't know, and these are people who are going to their doctors and their doctors saying, you're not trying hard enough, you got to pay more attention, you got to work harder because your 8% and 9% and 10% is just not good enough. What these patients don't know is that in the whole world of type 1 diabetics, only 15% of them ever manage to get near that 7%. So the question you might ask yourself is it the diabetic or is it something else? Because I think that in a classroom, if 85% of the students are failing, you might want to talk to the professor. So in our opinion, it's the way type 1 diabetes is being treated with sub-Q insulin. A godsend. It keeps us alive. It's the only treatment that made a difference between death and living at least a good life in a way. However, I think we've reached the end of making sub-Q insulin better and better and better. Untold millions are being spent to try to make insulins better, to make them start faster, stop faster, last longer, all kinds of different modes of action to try to help the diabetic to level out their blood glucose levels. The same is being spent on external pumps and continuous glucose sensors and trying to link them together in the so-called artificial pancreas to inject insulin into the skin relative to what blood sugars are doing, and then have this algorithm decide how much more insulin you need. These are all noble efforts, but the one problem is the insulin's going under the skin. And what we know physiologically is that in the non-diabetic person, when the pancreas releases insulin, 100% of it goes directly to the liver. And the liver holds on to up to 80% of it. Only a tiny fraction ever goes out to the rest of the body. When you stick the insulin under the skin, all of it goes out to the rest of the body. And only a tiny bit makes it back to the liver. So why is that a problem? Because the liver is the primary organ for maintaining level blood sugar. The pancreas itself is a signaling device. The beta cells sit there and record the changes in blood sugar. And then if it goes up, they put insulin out. If it goes down, they stop putting insulin. The organ that does all the work is the liver. And if it's not getting a proper signal, it's harder and harder to maintain a level blood sugar. And fortunately, recently, there are some very elegant research papers that have come out explaining why when type 1 diabetics try to control very, very tightly and get their blood sugars down, they enter an area of danger. And the area of danger is that they risk shooting off into super low blood sugar or super high blood sugar because they're trying to get down into a normal range while their liver is not being treated properly. That's a simplification, of course. What's different about the implantable insulin pump, when you drip the insulin into the peritoneum, which is the space where your intestines float and organs float, a good fact of nature is that that insulin is picked up by the capillary beds and sent directly to the liver. And so it's not exactly the same as the normal person's pancreas working, but it's the closest we ever had. So the type 1 diabetic on the implantable insulin pump has what's almost a normal physiology, where there's this gradient of high insulin going into the liver and low insulin in the rest of the body. A type 1 diabetic with subcutaneous insulin treatment has high insulin in the rest of the body and low insulin going to the liver. This is profoundly different and really is the key to why people with type 1 diabetes with an implantable pump feel better, can control their diabetes much more easily. And you still have to work at it, you still have to pay attention, you have to measure your blood sugar right now. But the effort and the result, the effort is much lower and the results are much better. Life is better. You can actually spend your attention on the other parts of life that are so important. Now, in the future, what we're hoping to see is a much more advanced, technologically advanced, more reliable, much smaller implantable pump that delivers the insulin to the peritoneum and also in the peritoneum measures blood glucose. Because the peritoneum space is better than measuring blood glucose under the skin, which is the way all the other monitors do it. So if we get to this point where we're delivering insulin to the peritoneum with the implantable pump and we're measuring the glucose levels in the peritoneum, and we have an algorithm that connects the two, we'll really be able to have what they call the artificial pancreas. It will work, and there is research that proves that this is the case. This is not just hypothetical. There have been enough studies done that this will work, whereas the external artificial pancreas, which injects under the skin and measures under the skin, is fraught with difficulties. And we can't get away with those difficulties without getting away from sub-Q injection and moving to intraperitoneal injections. The implantable pump gets us as close to normal as possible. It's not perfect, it's not exactly the same as being normal, but it's as close as we can ever get. And it makes a huge difference. In the early 90s, 10 of us that have this pump were asked to have a support group meeting, and they brought a psychologist in to talk to us. And the psychologist asked us, I don't want to hear from the pump users, I want to hear from the significant others. What's it like? Is there any difference? And it was a riot. Everybody that lives with us said, he's so much easier, she's so much easier to live with, life is so much more comfortable. And I stopped and thought, I didn't realize that. And then I thought more about it. I thought, well, yeah, if you're fighting every day to maintain, if you're working, spending most of your effort, a huge amount of effort on this, you're probably not quite as nice and easygoing as you might be. And then you get this pump and life gets better. Life looks a little different to you. That's a big difference. It's a common thought that people with type 1 diabetes are doing fine. There's no real problem here. You got your insulin, everything's fine. The underlying truth is that those people, if you look onto the diabetes blogs and the websites that people put up, there's huge discontent. People are suffering, people are not living lives that they're happy with. They're struggling way too hard, and a lot of them are just giving up. The answer is that the way they're trying to control their diabetes with the current available technologies is missing something very important. And the patient is being burdened with this. The doctors are telling them, you're not working hard enough, you're not trying hard enough, you're not compliant enough. If you just tried harder. So there's a huge guilt that goes on here. Now, the fact is, of course, everybody can try harder and work harder and do a better job at everything they do. But the underlying, very deep truth is that only 15% of all these type 1 diabetics ever get near what their doctors are asking them to do. You can't deny that. You can't ignore that. And I believe, and those of us who've experienced the implantable insulin pump believe, it's because the insulin is going the wrong direction, and it's not getting us to the more normal state that we get with the implantable insulin pump. So yes, I've thought about going to France every 3 months, flying back and forth, all the expense, everything else. Just cut it out, quit it. Just go back on sub-Q. Well, fortunately, I get to experience that every once in a while when the pump malfunctions, because again, it's a prototype, not a final device. I lose the intraperitoneal insulin, and that's what my wife says to me. See, see, it's not so good, is it? You need to be going to France. And when I get back on the implantable pump, within 24 hours, 48 hours, everything changes. And people say I look different evenly. So this is important. I have it. I go back and forth and do this. Most people can't. And I can't sit here and not do everything I can to make this available to all the rest of the people that are in my position with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetics that live with sub-Q insulin don't know what they're missing. And if they find out, they'll never give it up. And I need to do something whatever I can to help them have that opportunity. Well, what's next is facing the facts. The current pump that is no longer available in the United States is an advanced prototype. It's too large for young people to have, for instance, or for petite women. Okay for a large guy like me, but still too large for the most population. Its technology is mired back in the 1980s. Some updates since then, but not a lot. And there's been a massive change in technical ability and engineering capabilities for developing these devices since that time. So my hope is that the company that has this pump now would overnight decide to focus all their energy on it, and they may do that, and that would be wonderful. And they may not, because they have reasons for what they do in their business, and I appreciate and respect that. Alternatively, I'm hoping we can get another company to enter the fray. There are people out there in the world who are superbly capable engineers in this area, and there is some interest in developing a new pump. Our foundation has two basic goals: get a new pump built and help the community know that we do have this option available if we help to make it happen. It's the best kept secret around. There's a better way to live with type 1 diabetes. With the implantable insulin pump, my life is just simply better. The effort required to keep very tight control and know that I can avoid the long-term complications is far less than it is sub-Q insulin. And I feel indescribably better all the time.